The sound of splintering wood echoed across the frozen wasteland. In the dead silence of the Antarctic night, the Endurance, Shackleton's mighty ship, was dying. The crushing ice groaned, twisted, and finally snapped her spine like a twig. Shackleton stood in silence, watching it happen. His men gathered around, their breath freezing in the frigid air. They had spent months trapped in the ice, hoping for a miracle. Now, that hope was gone. The ship that had carried them to the edge of the earth was sinking into the very ice that had held them prisoner. And they were alone. 1,000 miles from the nearest human outpost, with no way to call for help, nothing but frozen wilderness in every direction. Their only option? Survive or die trying. But the worst part? Shackleton knew this was just the beginning. How did they get here? What could possibly drive these men to face certain death in the coldest, most isolated place on Earth? This is the story of Ernest Shackleton's doomed Antarctic expedition, a journey into the unknown that would push the limits of human endurance. In 1914, as the world stood on the brink of war, one man was preparing for an entirely different battle, one that had nothing to do with armies or borders. Sir Ernest Shackleton, a seasoned explorer with an unbreakable spirit, had set his sights on something far more dangerous: the untouched, frozen heart of Antarctica. Shackleton wasn't chasing glory or wealth. He was chasing history. His dream was to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot, a journey that no human had ever attempted before. Why Antarctica? At the time, the South Pole represented the last great frontier on Earth. This frozen wilderness was a place of extremes: bitter cold, howling winds, and treacherous ice, an alien world untouched by human hands. For explorers like Shackleton, this was the ultimate challenge. Conquering Antarctica would cement their legacy alongside the greatest explorers in history. But it wasn't just about fame. For Shackleton, this journey was a test of human endurance and leadership, a chance to push the limits of what mankind could endure. But there was a problem. Expeditions like these required immense resources. Ships, supplies, crews, everything came at a cost, and Shackleton needed backers. Luckily, his reputation as an experienced explorer helped him secure the funding he needed. Shackleton was no stranger to the harsh seas of the South. In 1902, he had been part of an earlier Antarctic expedition led by Robert Falcon Scott, during which he had gotten his first taste of the unforgiving ice. Later in 1907, Shackleton led his own expedition, the Nimrod Expedition, which brought him closer to the South Pole than any man before. Though he was forced to turn back just 97 miles from the pole, Shackleton's leadership and determination were admired worldwide. This time, Shackleton aimed for something even more ambitious. He managed to raise funds from a mix of private donations, government support, and even media sponsorships. Wealthy British philanthropists, the Royal Geographical Society, and even newspaper magnates who promised exclusive stories chipped in. Shackleton was a master at leveraging his connections and reputation to get the financial backing he needed. With the funds secured, he purchased a state-of-the-art ship, built specifically to withstand the crushing Antarctic ice. She was named the Endurance, a fitting name for what would become one of the most legendary voyages in history. Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition wasn't just another adventure. It was a chance to achieve what no one had before. He planned to sail the Endurance into the treacherous Weddell Sea, land at Vosel Bay, and from there lead a team across nearly 1,800 miles of uncharted frozen wilderness to the other side of the continent. This was a journey that could redefine exploration. Shackleton wanted to show that the human spirit could triumph over the most hostile environment on Earth. If he succeeded, he would be the first to cross the Antarctic, completing one of the greatest geographical feats of the time. If he failed, it would be a disaster not just for the men under his command, but for Shackleton's legacy as a leader. As Shackleton prepared to set sail, the First World War was beginning to tear Europe apart. In fact, when the Endurance left England in August 1914, war had just been declared. Shackleton even offered his ship and crew to the British Admiralty, but his offer was declined. The British government wanted him to continue his expedition, hoping it would bring a sense of national pride and achievement in such a dark time. The stakes were high, and the world was watching. The Endurance left port in August 1914, with Shackleton and his crew of 27 men. Spirits were high, their goal clear. They had prepared for every imaginable danger: the freezing temperatures, the endless isolation, the crushing ice floes. Shackleton had meticulously planned every step, confident in his men and his ship. But as the Endurance sailed deeper into the Weddell Sea, Antarctica began to show its true nature. The sea itself became a labyrinth of shifting ice floes. At first, the ship cracked through the ice like a knife. But as the days passed, the gaps between the floes began to close. Slowly, the ice tightened its grip around the ship, holding it in place. The men worked tirelessly, trying to break free, but it was no use. The Endurance had fought bravely against the ice for months, but by October 1915, it was clear. The ship was doomed. The Antarctic ice, relentless and crushing, had slowly squeezed the life out of the vessel. It wasn't a dramatic explosion or sudden sinking. It was worse. It was a slow, agonizing death. Every day, the crew listened to the creaking and groaning of the wooden beams as they bent under the pressure. The ice was a living beast, pressing in from all sides, relentless and unyielding. Shackleton's men had worked tirelessly, cutting ice, trying to free the ship, but it was futile. The moment they feared most came on October 27, 1915. The ice had finally crushed the Endurance beyond repair. The ship's ribs cracked with the sound of rifle shots, echoing across the frozen wasteland. Shackleton, always the leader, was the first to recognize what this meant. He gathered his men on deck. Their faces were hollow, exhaustion etched into every line. For months they had been waiting for some sign of rescue, some break in the ice. But now, standing there, watching the ship they had called home sink into the ice, they knew rescue wasn't coming. Shackleton's voice cut through the freezing air. "She's going, boys. It's time to get off." There was no panic, no shouting, just grim, silent acceptance. They had no choice. The Endurance was sinking, and they had to abandon ship. In that moment, the men weren't just leaving a ship, they were leaving behind their last connection to the outside world. The Endurance had been their shelter, their hope. Now they were stepping onto the ice with nothing but what they could carry. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, moved quickly. The men began throwing supplies overboard, dragging the lifeboats across the ice, anything they could salvage. They would need every scrap of food, every tool, every piece of equipment. There was no telling how long they would be stranded, but one thing was certain: they couldn't survive without supplies. As the men scrambled to save what they could, the Endurance groaned one last time. The pressure from the ice was too much. The deck buckled. The ship's bow plunged down, and slowly it disappeared beneath the ice, swallowed by the very thing that had imprisoned them. Shackleton stood watching until the end. He didn't speak. His men were looking to him for leadership, for some kind of reassurance, but even Shackleton knew the gravity of their situation. They were now truly alone, 1,200 miles from the nearest human settlement, stranded on a block of ice drifting in the Weddell Sea. The Antarctic was no place for hesitation, and Shackleton knew it. His mind was already racing with a plan, but as he looked at his men, cold, hungry, and exhausted, he knew the most important thing was to keep them focused, keep them moving. If they stopped, if they gave in to the despair of their situation, they would be dead within days. And as if the loss of the ship wasn't bad enough, another threat was looming on the horizon. The Antarctic weather was about to turn. Far off in the distance, dark clouds began to gather. Shackleton could feel the wind picking up. A storm was coming, and when it hit, the ice they stood on could crack and break apart, leaving them floating on deadly fragments. The men worked furiously, building makeshift camps on the ice. They dragged the lifeboats, heavy, cumbersome, and their only chance of escape, across the frozen ground. Shackleton issued his orders with the same calm authority that had kept them alive thus far, but inside, he was calculating their next move. As night fell, they huddled in their tents, the cold creeping in through every seam. The ship was gone, and they were left with nothing but a thin layer of ice between them and the freezing waters below. The storm was closing in. They could hear the distant howl of the wind as it moved closer, the ice beneath them beginning to groan under the pressure. Shackleton knew they couldn't stay here for long. The ice was shifting, and soon it would break apart. They needed to move, but where? The nearest land was hundreds of miles away, and they had no way of knowing what lay between them and safety. But Shackleton was determined. this was not the end. They had lifeboats, they had supplies, they had each other. Shackleton gathered his men around the dim glow of a campfire and told them what they needed to hear. They would survive this. They had no choice but to keep fighting. Tomorrow, they would begin the next chapter of their journey. A trek across the ice, dragging their boats behind them, searching for a way out of this frozen prison. With the Endurance gone, Shackleton's crew was truly at the mercy of the Antarctic. The vast, empty ice stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. It was beautiful in its desolation, but for the men, it was a nightmare. They were now stranded on a floating slab of ice, drifting aimlessly in the wet sea. And the clock was ticking. How long could they survive in such brutal conditions? Their only hope lay in the lifeboats they had salvaged from the Endurance. But dragging the boats across the thick, uneven ice was no easy task. Each boat weighed over a ton, and the ice was far from smooth. The floes were jagged, treacherous, often rising into sharp ridges that had to be hacked through with axes. Day after day, they struggled against the ice, pulling the boats inch by inch, hoping to find open water. But the ice was relentless. It shifted beneath their feet, groaning and cracking as if it were alive. Sometimes, without warning, a massive slab would split open, leaving a gaping crevasse in their path, forcing them to backtrack and find another way forward. As the days stretched into weeks, the men began to feel the true weight of their predicament. They were running out of supplies. The food they had salvaged from the ship would only last so long, and the constant cold made everything harder. The wind cut through their clothes like knives, their hands and feet were numb, and frostbite was a constant threat. Each night they huddled together in their tents, trying to stay warm. The temperatures often dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and even the thickest blankets offered little comfort. Sleep was fitful, haunted by the groans of the ice beneath them and the endless roar of the wind. And yet they knew they couldn't stop. To stop was to die. Shackleton knew this too. He could see the exhaustion in his men's eyes, the growing desperation. But if there was one thing Shackleton excelled at, it was keeping his men focused on survival. He knew that morale was just as important as food and warmth in a place like this. If the men gave in to despair, their fate was sealed. Every day, Shackleton led by example. He worked alongside his men, hauling the lifeboats, chopping ice, never once complaining. He knew that if he showed even a hint of weakness, it would spread like a virus through the camp. He had to keep their spirits up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. But there were cracks forming, not just in the ice, but in the crew's resolve. Some men began to question Shackleton's decisions. Thomas Ord-Lees, the storekeeper, was one of them. He was a pessimist by nature, and the longer they were trapped, the more he doubted Shackleton's ability to get them out alive. At night, he muttered about how they were doomed, how it was only a matter of time before they all froze to death. Shackleton knew that these whispers of doubt could be more dangerous than the ice itself. If the men lost faith in him, their unity would crumble. But he also knew that it was natural. Every man has a breaking point, and this situation was testing them all to their limits. The crew's physical condition was deteriorating as well. The cold was relentless, and many of the men began to suffer from frostbite. Perce Blackborough, the youngest member of the crew, was hit the hardest. His feet were so badly frostbitten that he could barely walk. Shackleton made the difficult decision to have Blackborough ride in one of the lifeboats, carried by the other men. But even this was a temporary solution. The longer they stayed on the ice, the more their bodies would give out. As if the physical toll wasn't enough, they were also battling hunger. Their rations were meager. Just enough to keep them going, but not enough to stave off the gnawing hunger that came with constant exertion in the cold. Shackleton knew they needed to stretch their food supplies as far as possible, but as the days dragged on, it became clear they would have to make some hard decisions. And then came the dogs. The dogs had been an essential part of the expedition from the start. 49 hardy huskies that had pulled sledges and acted as companions to the men. But now, they were becoming a burden. Feeding the dogs was a luxury they could no longer afford. Shackleton knew what had to be done, but it was a decision that weighed heavily on him. One by one, The dogs were shot, their meat used to supplement the crew's rations. It was a grim task. Many of the men had grown attached to the animals, and watching them die was just another reminder of how desperate their situation had become. But it had to be done. Survival came first. By this time, weeks had passed, and they were no closer to finding open water. The ice stretched on, seemingly endless, and the men began to lose hope. Were they just walking in circles, dragging the boats across the ice for nothing? The constant cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, it was all taking its toll. Shackleton knew they needed to change tactics. They couldn't keep dragging the boats forever. The ice was shifting, and there was a real danger that it would break apart beneath them. If they could find a large, stable floe, maybe they could set up camp and wait for the ice to carry them closer to land. It was a gamble, but it was their only option. And so, Shackleton made the decision. They would stop their march and camp on the ice, hoping that the floe they were on would drift toward land. It was a risky move. If the floe broke apart, they would be at the mercy of the freezing waters. But Shackleton had no choice. The men were too weak to continue dragging the boats, and they needed to conserve their strength for what lay ahead. The next few days were a waiting game. They set up their camp, patched their tents, and rationed their remaining food. Every crack in the ice sent a shiver down their spines. Every gust of wind threatened to tear their fragile tents apart. They were drifting now, helpless passengers on a sea of ice, praying for land to appear on the horizon. But as the days passed, something miraculous happened. The ice began to break up. Not under their feet, but ahead of them. Open water was just within reach. After weeks of being trapped, they finally had a way out. Shackleton gathered his men. The boats they had so painstakingly dragged across the ice were finally going to be put to use. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in months, they had a glimmer of hope. They would take to the sea, rowing across the freezing waters in search of salvation. But the Antarctic was not done with them yet. The open ocean held dangers far greater than the ice. And with the supplies running dangerously low, it would take everything they had to survive the final leg of their journey. Shackleton knew the risks. The Weddell Sea was notorious for its brutal freezing winds, and the waves were unforgiving. But there was no other option. If they stayed on the ice, they would drift further out to sea, possibly never to be seen again. Their only hope was to take the lifeboats and make for Elephant Island, a barren, rocky outcrop some 100 miles away. It wasn't a true sanctuary, but it was land, and it was their best chance. With every man exhausted and supplies almost gone, this journey would be their most dangerous yet. Shackleton ordered his men to prepare the boats. The 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, were their only lifelines. These small vessels, barely large enough to carry the entire crew, were all that stood between them and the icy, violent waters of the Antarctic Ocean. As they loaded the boats with what little they had left, the reality of the situation hit hard. They were about to face some of the most dangerous seas in the world, in open boats, with no shelter from the wind or the waves. The Antarctic, as always, showed no mercy. On April 9, 1916, after months of waiting and battling the ice, Shackleton gave the order. They pushed off from the ice floe, their home for so long, and set out into the open sea. The wind howled, the waves crashed over the sides of the boats, and within minutes, they were soaked to the bone. The men rowed with every ounce of strength they had left, but the cold was unbearable. Shackleton, ever the leader, took his place in the James Caird, the sturdiest of the 3 boats. He knew this was a gamble. The chances of making it to Elephant Island were slim, but he also knew that if they didn't try, they were as good as dead. The sea was a monster. Waves towered over them, each one threatening to capsize their fragile boats. The men clung to their oars, battling the freezing spray that hit them with the force of a whip. Every stroke was a fight against the sea, the wind, and their own exhaustion. Hours turned into days. The men rowed without rest, their hands raw and blistered from the ropes, their faces cracked from the cold. They had no shelter from the elements, no way to escape the freezing wind that tore at them constantly. Each man knew that one mistake, a lapse in concentration, a misstep in the boat, could mean death. The sea was waiting to claim them. Shackleton, ever watchful, kept the men focused. He knew that this was the final test. The Antarctic had thrown everything at them, and now it was trying to break them one last time. But Shackleton's will was iron. He would not let them fail. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of land, but the ocean seemed endless. The waves crashed endlessly, and the freezing spray soaked them through. Several of the men were on the verge of collapse. They had been rowing for days with little sleep, their bodies pushed to the absolute limit. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, navigated the stormy waters, using only a pocket compass and his instincts to guide them. In these conditions, even the smallest error could mean disaster. Days passed with no sign of land. The men's strength was fading fast. Perce Blackborough, whose frost-bitten feet had left him unable to row, was now so weak he could barely sit up in the boat. The cold had numbed their bodies, but the fear kept them moving. Would they ever reach land, or would the sea claim them, their story lost forever in the freezing waters of the Antarctic? Just when the men began to lose hope, a shout came from the James Caird. Land! Through the fog and freezing spray, they saw it, the jagged, rocky outline of Elephant Island. A cheer went up from the boats, but it was short-lived. The island was still miles away, and the sea was as rough as ever. But the sight of land gave them the strength they needed. The men rowed with renewed vigor, every muscle in their bodies screaming in pain. Elephant Island was a desolate, barren place, but to them it was paradise. If they could just make it to shore, they would have a chance, however slim, of survival. Finally, after 5 days of battling the ocean, they made landfall. April 15th, 1916, the first time they had set foot on solid ground in nearly 500 days. Exhausted, starving, and frozen, they staggered onto the beach of Elephant Island. Some of the men collapsed, too weak to stand. But they had made it. Against all odds, they had survived the ocean's fury. But their ordeal was far from over. Elephant Island was not a safe haven. It was a frozen, wind-swept rock, far from any shipping routes. They were still stranded, and no one knew where they were. Shackleton realized that their only chance of rescue was to take one of the lifeboats and make a desperate journey to South Georgia, where a whaling station offered the hope of help. Shackleton chose the James Caird, the strongest of the 3 lifeboats, and handpicked 5 of his fittest men to accompany him on what would become one of the most legendary sea voyages in history. The distance? 800 miles of the roughest seas on Earth. Their boat? An open lifeboat, barely fit for the task. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his small crew set sail from Elephant Island. Their mission was simple, yet almost impossible: to reach South Georgia, raise the alarm, and come back for the rest of the men. But no one had ever attempted a voyage like this in such a small boat. It was a suicide mission, but Shackleton knew it was their only hope. The men left behind on Elephant Island watched as the James Caird disappeared into the horizon. They had no idea if Shackleton would make it, no idea if they would ever be rescued. All they could do was wait and hope that their leader, the man who had led them through so much, could perform one last miracle. On April 24, 1916, Ernest Shackleton and his hand-picked crew of 5 men, Frank Worsley, Tom Crean, Tim McCarthy, John Vincent, and Harry McNeish, set off in the tiny lifeboat, the James Caird, embarking on what would become one of the most daring and dangerous voyages ever attempted. Their destination? South Georgia, a remote island 800 miles away, where a whaling station held the promise of rescue. But the journey was nothing short of a suicide mission. The James Caird was a 22-foot lifeboat built for short distances, not open ocean crossings. It wasn't designed to survive the monstrous waves of the Southern Ocean. But Shackleton knew this was their only hope. If they stayed on Elephant Island, the rest of the crew would surely die from starvation or exposure. Their only chance at rescue lay across the most treacherous seas in the world. The 6 men squeezed into the James Caird, loaded with just enough supplies to last a few weeks. Every inch of the boat was packed: food, water, navigational tools, and the little canvas shelter they had rigged to protect themselves from the freezing wind and waves. Shackleton stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The fate of his entire crew rested on this one journey. The Southern Ocean is known for its ferocity. Waves as high as 50 feet, freezing temperatures, and relentless winds whipped the tiny boat from all sides. From the very first hour, the men were soaked to the bone, their bodies freezing in the bitter cold. Water constantly sloshed around the boat, drenching their legs, seeping into their clothes, threatening to sink the vessel with every crashing wave. Frank Worsley, the navigator, had the impossible task of steering them toward South Georgia using only a pocket compass and sextant. Most of the time, they had no visibility, just storm clouds, thick fog, and the unending roar of the sea. Worsley had only brief moments where the sun broke through the clouds, allowing him to take a reading. And yet, somehow, through pure skill and instinct, Worsley kept them on course, guiding them across the vast, merciless ocean. But the sea was not their only enemy. The cold was unbearable. The men's clothes were permanently wet, their bodies stiff from the cold, and frostbite was creeping into their fingers and toes. At night, they took turns lying under the small canvas tarp, trying to sleep in shifts, but the freezing wind cut through their meager shelter like a blade. Harry McNish, the ship's carpenter, lashed the boat together, keeping the makeshift mast and sails secure despite the constant battering from the waves. Day after day, night after night, they battled the ocean. The seas were relentless, the sky a constant gray. Each wave threatened to capsize them, each moment bringing them closer to the brink of death. There were times when they wondered if they would survive the night, times when the boat was nearly swallowed by the sea, but Shackleton refused to let them give up. His leadership was the only thing that kept them together. He drove them forward, giving them hope when there was none to be found. On the 5th day, they were hit by a brutal storm. The wind howled, the waves grew to towering heights, and the temperature plunged. The men huddled together under the tarp, desperately trying to stay warm. The boat was tossed like a toy in the storm, water crashing over the sides, drenching them in freezing spray. Worsley, soaked and exhausted, fought to keep the boat on course, while Shackleton did everything he could to keep the men focused. But the storm was unlike anything they had faced before. The waves grew larger, towering over the tiny boat. They could barely see the sky through the sheets of rain and spray. The boat tilted dangerously as each wave crashed down on them, threatening to send them into the freezing depths of the ocean. Somehow, through sheer willpower, they survived the storm. But they were exhausted, barely clinging to life, their bodies numb with cold. They had been at sea for 2 weeks, and their supplies were almost gone. The food was running out, the water was dangerously low, and the salt water had seeped into their clothes and skin, leaving them cracked and bleeding. But then on the 14th day, a miracle. Through the fog and mist, they saw it, South Georgia. The jagged cliffs rose up from the ocean, towering above them like a beacon of hope. They had made it. Against all odds, after 800 miles of the most dangerous ocean in the world, they had reached land. But their ordeal wasn't over yet. The winds were too strong, and the seas too rough to land the boat on the western side of the island where the whaling station was located. They were forced to land on the opposite side, in a remote, uninhabited part of South Georgia. The cliffs were steep and jagged, and they had no choice but to land in a small cove, exhausted and half dead from their journey. Shackleton knew that if they stayed here, they would die. The whaling station was on the other side of the island, but there was no way to sail around. They would have to cross the island on foot, a journey that had never been attempted before. The interior of South Georgia was a maze of glaciers, mountains, and treacherous terrain. But Shackleton didn't hesitate. Leaving 3 of the men behind to recover, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean set off across the island. They had no map, no real equipment, and no idea what lay ahead, but they knew that time was running out. Their crew on Elephant Island was still stranded, waiting for rescue, and if they didn't reach the whaling station soon, it would be too late. For 36 hours, the 3 men marched across the island, climbing over glaciers, slipping down icy slopes, and navigating through freezing winds. Exhaustion was setting in, their bodies pushed far beyond the limit, but they couldn't stop. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they saw it. The whaling station in the distance, smoke rising from the chimneys. When they stumbled into the station, dirty, half-frozen, and barely alive, they were greeted with disbelief. No one could believe that these men had just crossed one of the most dangerous oceans in the world in a lifeboat, and then trekked across the island's uncharted wilderness. Shackleton had done it. He had made it, but his work was far from over. He still had to rescue the rest of his men on Elephant Island. After reaching the whaling station on South Georgia, Shackleton wasted no time. He knew that his men on Elephant Island were still in grave danger, and the clock was ticking. He had already endured unimaginable hardships. Now, it was time to bring his crew back home. Shackleton's first step was to secure a vessel that could make the treacherous journey back to Elephant Island. Fortunately, he found a whaling captain named Ludwig Larsen who was willing to assist him. Shackleton quickly explained the dire situation and the urgent need to rescue his crew. Without hesitation, Larsen agreed to take Shackleton back across the turbulent sea. They set sail on May 5, 1916, aboard the whaling ship Southern Sky. As they navigated back through the icy waters of the Weddell Sea, Shackleton felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. Would his men still be alive after all this time? They had endured over 4 months of hardship, and he could only hope that their will to survive had held strong. The journey back was perilous. The sea was still angry, with towering waves and icy winds that threatened to capsize the ship at any moment. Shackleton and his small crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship on course. Their minds focused on the goal ahead, to rescue the men they had left behind. After 3 days of navigating the treacherous waters, they finally spotted Elephant Island on May 8th. Shackleton's heart raced as they approached the familiar landscape of jagged cliffs and icy shores, but there was no time for celebration. They needed to find the men and get them off the island before the weather turned worse. As they landed on the island, Shackleton and Larsen gathered a small group of sailors and set off to search for the camp. They had no idea what they would find, but hope surged within Shackleton as he thought of his men waiting in the cold. When they reached the camp, it was eerily quiet. Shackleton's heart sank as he feared the worst, but then he spotted them. His men, huddled together, their faces gaunt but alive. The crew erupted into cheers upon seeing their leader. They had survived against all odds, holding on to hope that Shackleton would return for them. In that moment, the months of despair, the brutal cold, and the endless struggle melted away. Shackleton embraced his men, overwhelmed with relief. They were safe, and now they would all return home together. However, there was no time to waste. They quickly loaded the men onto the Southern Sky, cramming them into the small ship, their bodies weary and worn, but filled with a renewed sense of hope. Shackleton issued orders to set sail as quickly as possible. The journey back to civilization was fraught with danger, and they needed to make the crossing before the harsh Antarctic weather returned. As they departed from Elephant Island, the men gazed back at the land that had been both their prison and their sanctuary. They had survived the worst nature could throw at them, and now they were on their way home. But the sea was still treacherous. For the next few days, they battled storms, strong winds, and relentless waves. Shackleton remained vigilant, encouraging his men to stay strong, even as exhaustion crept in again. The sight of land became a distant memory, swallowed by the harsh reality of the open ocean. Finally, on May 20th, 1916, after a grueling journey, they reached South Georgia once more. As they docked, Shackleton's heart swelled with pride and relief. The men had endured the impossible, and now they were safe. But their trials weren't quite over yet. They still had to navigate back to the whaling station and ensure everyone was accounted for. Shackleton worked tirelessly, organizing the transfer of his men to the whaling ship for a final journey to safety. After securing passage for the crew and making sure everyone was taken care of, Shackleton turned his attention to the remaining men who had stayed behind on Elephant Island. He had promised them he would return, and he intended to keep that promise. By August 30th, 1916, all of Shackleton's men were finally reunited at Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. They had survived the unimaginable and emerged from the frozen depths of despair to see the warmth of home again. When they arrived, they were met with cheers and disbelief. Shackleton and his crew were hailed as heroes, not just for their endurance, but for their incredible spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story of survival became legendary, inspiring countless others to face their own challenges with courage and resolve. In the years that followed, Shackleton would continue to be a figure of inspiration, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. His leadership during those dark days in the Antarctic would be remembered for generations to come. The lessons learned through his trials, courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of brotherhood remain as relevant today as they were over a century ago. Shackleton's incredible voyage was more than just a story of survival. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can shine through, leading us back to the light. Shackleton and his men's survival is a powerful reminder of the human spirit's strength. Through unimaginable odds, they endured, proving that with courage and unity, we can overcome anything. If this story moved you, please like the video and subscribe for more tales of perseverance.